And we will have a few people still joining us. Let's see here. Welcome, welcome everyone. Okay. All right, and I'll keep my eyes on the waiting room. I see Klaus, hello, and Joan and Nigel. Eleonora, hi Nigel, good to see you. It's been too long. Let's see. And Patrick, oh, this is such a wonderful group. Okay. All right, and then we have, oh, it's 2 o'clock now. So I'll keep my eye on the waiting room, allowing people to come in or admitting people to come in. But otherwise, I think we can probably go ahead and begin. Okay, just any other last minutes. I'll give it 1 more minute, just so I don't miss anybody as we begin. If everyone could place your microphones on mute until the question and answer time, please. Okay, great. All right, I think we can go ahead and begin. This is recorded, just so you know, and if you're comfortable with it, you should have received a little pop-up that said you are entering a recording. If not, you can go ahead and turn off your video at any time. We do love to see faces, though. Thank you so much for joining for this month's ALGA, Ecological Law and Governance Association webinar on our democratic crisis, building covenant with one another and the earth. And I must say, this is truly like a family reunion for me. Ron and Bruce have guided me, supported me, thought with me since my own introduction into this world of global governance and ethics about 16 years ago now. 16 years, Ron and Bruce. And it's a true pleasure to be together again for this conversation with you all. And this conversation goes at the heart of who we are, how we choose to relate, how we choose to govern, and yet understands that often those choices are made for us, and some more than others, with structures manipulated or systems corrupted. We have a democracy problem. To anyone paying attention, this is no novel statement. We see it with the struggle for democracy in Hong Kong, the genocide of the Uyghurs in China, the enslavement of fishermen in Thailand, the enslavement of children by Nestle Cargill in the Ivory Coast, the fight against political corruption and for true racial justice in South Africa, the annexation of Crimea, the militarized occupation of Palestine, chemical warfare in Syria, refugees drowning in the Mediterranean, or being imprisoned in islands off of Australia. Children in cages, Children in cages in the United States, a constant and direct attack on one person, one vote, and all of it dripping with white supremacy. We see populist leaders deny COVID, attack education, and turn a blind eye to the murder of women and indigenous peoples, all while the Amazon burns. This is where we are, and this is a crisis of ethics, of values, of governance. This webinar seeks to explore the roots of our crisis of democracy, the betrayals we are witnessing, the underlying political and moral psychology of those who seek to corrupt or manipulate democracy, and a way out. A thread to the entire conversation will be how covenant is an ethical, political, and spiritual practice and idea. What do we mean by covenant? Why do we make covenants? Why do we break covenants? What is the power of a covenant? And what are the implications for humans and nature? Our nation's leaders make beautiful promises. We see this in the myriad forms of agreements between nations. But what does that mean when it is not followed by action or enough action? Or some agreements, written and unwritten, honored by others? Some honored more so than others. Our words of relations, treaty, compact, contract, agreement, rendered meaningless by our relations. How do we move forward from these created and broken covenants? My name is Catherine Guazdon. Most of you know me as Katie. I am the executive director of the Center for Environmental Ethics and Law and a founding member of the Ecological Law and Governance Association. And I will be serving as chair today. Each speaker will be given about 15 to 20 minutes to introduce their ideas. I will open, then turn to Bruce, followed by Ron. We will then have a short response time by the panelists. The floor will then be open for Q&A, and I hope that you are all engaged because that is why we're here together. You may type your question in the chat box, or you may simply type your name, and I will keep track of who has come in and in the order received. Please mute your microphones throughout the entirety of the meeting until the final Q&A session is opened. And please note that it is being recorded. If there is a disconnect, because we've all been in these and it does happen, please try to return in the next 5 to 7 minutes. And if for some reason it still is not connecting, we may find other options, whether rescheduling or recording. So, okay. So to begin, let me just let in these last few people that are waiting. Admit. And then let me share my screen. Here we go. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? All right. Okay. When we think of international law and governance, or simply of international relations, we may think of just that, relations, dialogue, even solidarity. And then we may think of who is making those relations, of who has the power and choice to make those relations. And so we may think of nation states, and then of sovereignty. And that is when we see these global relations come alive and be solidified in trade, travel, security, and environmental agreements and organizations. Yet all of the promises that nations make one another on all of the issues confirm one particular reality. No matter the strength of state sovereignty or the fervor of nationalism, all of these decisions, all of these agreements, all of these actions affect one another and us all. Indeed, we exist in our relations with one another for good and bad. And make no mistake, state sovereignty, the independent but utterly dependent state, is the reigning power in international law and governance. Maybe that's why so much is failing. The power in global governance, the nation state, is based on a misconception, a lie, that the nation state is indeed independent. And what are the roots to this system? The system of international relations, law, and governance: war and peacemaking, brutality and care, enslavement and liberty, imperialism, independence, colonialism, capitalism, religion, genocide, development, predation, growth, harm. We have a complex, entangled history of our covenants created and our covenants broken with one another. And yet from these roots of colonialism, of slavery, of power and predation, we eternally seek a better way forward. Admitting some more people. And yet from these roots, we eternally seek a better way forward. Not understanding that the same values and systems that defended that barbarity and inhumanity still exist today. Enslavement and liberty. Liberty for some. Imperialism and independence. Independence for some. Colonialism and capitalism. Poverty is a policy choice. Poverty is intended. Inequality is a policy choice. Inequality is intended. Just look at development, the cure-all to politicians, and even to many within the environmental movement. Look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Noting here that harm is a relational word in action, just as development is a relational word in action. For a movement that attempts to bring present and future generations to light, to peace and prosperity, it does so with a word, development, that is historically dark, something more representative of the depths of human depravity and environmental destruction than human enlightenment and environmental protection. Throughout history and even present day, development is a term and an act that is synonymous with harm, injustice, and oppression. Development and the righteous cause of development has and continues to erase cultures, enslave and kill humans, foster and create vast inequality, and poison our soils, air, and water. Development is at the heart of colonialism and imperialism, annexation and occupation, indigenous erasure and re-education, and land grabs and mass habitat destruction. Development is the language of the oppressive white patriarchy, these global leaders who created our crises and brought the world to today. Simply covering that word with something as beautiful, as sustainable, as hopeful, as sustainable, or flourishing of life or peace does not absolve it from its past evils. Indeed, it instead weakens the power and potential of the word sustainability. The development model itself follows the language of harm, the language of neoliberalism, and the inequality that is its very purpose. It should be well understood by now that when you use the frames and language of your opponents, you don't persuade them to adopt your point of view. Instead, you adopt theirs while strengthening their resistance to your objectives. The development approach has never been sustainable, and indeed it has created unsustainability. Yet this is the framework to which we expect the SDGs to succeed. Or maybe they were never expected to succeed. Indeed, the methodology, purpose, and principles behind much of international law and governance today, and as witnessed in domestic and international courts and international negotiations, appear as nothing more than modern-day colonialism. A bit evolved, a bit more hidden, easier to flourish within authoritarianism, but still a central part of modern Western democracies. Through a veil of economic development, you find economic exploitation. Through a veil of democratic global trade and free market, you find imperialistic, authoritarian, and enslaving decision-making. You find plantation economics. Through a veil of the betterment of our citizens, of our society, you find direct harm to people, their lives and livelihoods, and particularly to the most vulnerable, indigenous peoples, minorities, women, children, religious minorities, targeted communities. To that other, you find direct harm also to the environment. We bear witness to this every moment of our lives. And in fact, it's the source of what we do, why we do, of our passions and our work. Through this veil of modern international law and governance, even democracy, you find an old evil harm, colonialism. You see power imbalances, political power within and between nations, the predation on the poor, vulnerable nations with corrupt governments or weaker regulations. Those are the ones to make agreements with or investments with. You see a transfer of externalities, of harms. Let me take my mass agriculture and have it in this country instead of my own. The deepening of inequality, the dispossession of communities, the reliance and dependence of communities and nations on investor nations or industries, gross human rights violations, child labor, slavery, genocide, land grabs, massive environmental harm, poisoning of air, water, soils, overfishing, the list goes on, crime, corruption, even murder, and the fraying of democratic principles with a strengthening of authoritarian principles. These are the same seeds of power, economy, racism, and exploitation that were planted centuries ago. So we must ask ourselves, has colonialism returned to our international relations, or has it never left? The grasp for geopolitical power through power imbalances between nations is modern-day colonialism. Unbridled capitalism is modern-day colonialism. Making political decisions that create the poor, keep the poor poor, and broaden the divide between great wealth and extreme poverty is modern-day colonialism. Exploiting and dehumanizing women and children, treating indigenous peoples and minorities as less deserving to human rights, public health, freedom, even life is modern-day colonialism. Targeting nations for their natural abundance to usurp, use, and destroy that natural abundance is exactly colonialism. And the harm to humans and the harm to nature cannot be separated. Remember, land grabs occur for human consumption and production, and geopolitical power and security. Illegal logging and the murder of environmental defenders occurs for trade, economy, development, power. Harm occurs to others for the benefit of others. That is the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. And this is why human rights and justice, relational aspects of law and governance, yet often sold as individual, will always be a critical component of any response to colonialism, as colonialism exists because of the dehumanization of people. Indeed, it's dependent upon it. And it not only relies on the oppressor dehumanizing the oppressed, but the oppressor becoming dehumanized in the process. Our soils and our souls are savaged. And it is important, crucial even, to note that all of our foundational human rights texts were written amidst grave human rights violations, and sometimes by the authors themselves. These are our roots. Jean-Paul Sartre stated, "Let us quit this Europe which talks incessantly about man while massacring him wherever it meets him, on every corner of its own streets, on every corner of the world." What empty chatter. Liberty, equality, fraternity, love, honor, country, and who knows what else. Europeans have only been able to make themselves humans by creating slaves and monsters. The UDHR, ICCPR, ICSCR, the holy trinity of human rights documents, beautiful, important, that for peace, for human rights, for democracy. But we cannot deny the gaps between words and actions, even between laws, existing laws, and inaction. And we cannot deny how little of a role they play in international relations, law, and governance. We are talking here about legal systems of harm and abuse, often legal, by the most powerful nations on earth and the most powerful institutions on earth for the most powerful of reasons. This harm to you, a place, species, habitat, individual, or nation, grows my economy. Or this harm to you increases my security. If only they could see the harm in that thinking. Liberty, equality, fraternity for all. No, liberty, equality, fraternity for some. And it continues today through our political and economic entanglements, these Faustian pacts that divide communities and tribes, that create a subhuman species, that show us the impotence of human rights before capital. In our global governing relational system, capital is king. We often argue about anthropocentrism in law. Well, the impotence of human rights before trade should then be particularly galling. Perhaps we are more in a world of dollar centrism. As for nature, for the foundations of life and life itself, neoliberalism, colonialism is a death cult. That is what we're up against. After all, oppression, overwhelming control is necrophilic. It is nourished by death, not life. That's from Paulo Freire. There is no biophilia, only necrophilia. The necrophilious person is driven by the desire to transform the organic into the inorganic, to approach life mechanically, as if all living persons were things. Having rather than being is what counts. The necrophilious person can relate to an object only if he possesses it, a flower or a person. Hence, a threat to his possession is a threat to himself. If he loses possession, he loses contact with that world. He loves control, and in that act of controlling, he kills life. Property, possession, ownership, that is the foundation of our legal system. And as far as approaching life mechanically, as if living persons are things, colonialism is the commodification of nature and people. Capitalism is explicitly the commodification of nature and people. Life, the natural richness of a nation, is what attracts this necrophilia. That is what unites nations. Human rights be damned, democracy be damned, chasing and destroying life and creating the relationships to allow this process to continue is the history and current path of colonialism and of global governance. And let's be clear, Colonialism is not always as clear as slavery, although that exists today. Simón Bolívar extended the concept of slavery from physical enslavement to political powerlessness, to citizenship in a land where unjust rules ruled. People are slaves when the government, by its essence or through its vices, tramples and usurps the rights of the citizen or subject. We see this today everywhere. I live 5 miles from Washington, D.C. We see this today everywhere. But the realization and defense of human rights, civil and political rights, can counter this if the political will is present. But what if the political institutions have been corrupted and malformed, even sold as democracy, to the point where people lose faith in democracy and instead turn to saviors and strongmen, those who initially corrupted that democracy? We cannot deny that the links of capital link nations. One simple agreement or investment is never one simple agreement or investment, but an entire enterprise that consistently grows, often with compounding harm. But if nations demanded better, instead of turning blind eyes to connected harms, all of these relationships could be opportunities for good. No, China, we will not trade with you if you continue to destroy fisheries and forests in other nations. If you continue to systematically wipe out entire people. Can you imagine? No, United States, we will not create a security arrangement with you if you systematically target Black people for state violence, incarceration, and capital punishment. Can you imagine that world? But leaders may argue we must have these relationships, we must destroy the forests or take the lands or even harm people, target people, in order to have economic growth or geopolitical security. But remember, intentional poverty and inequality is a necessary part of the colonial system. So an economic solution to this is not possible. Or these great and powerful leaders may simply hide behind their sovereign borders. What is happening to the Uyghurs is none of your business. What is happening to the refugees at our border is none of your business. All hail state sovereignty, a fake independence in an entirely relational world. So how do we help a death cult die? To do that, well, what can liberate us all from these shackles of an economic system that destroys us all? Life, only and intentionally life, and all the relations that it entails. To do that, we must look at principles of decolonialism. It is itself a form of struggle and survival. It is an existence-based response and practice, a forceful rejection of social classification based on race, gender, heteropatriarchy, and class, and the concept of power as conquerors over the conquered, and the structural foundation tied to modernity and capitalism. A key aspect of decolonial theory is action. Whether looking at Sartre, Fanon, Arndt, or Freire, even the mass movements against racism today, where you hear calls for anti-racism, or in other words, acts towards the dismantling of the systems and institutions of racism, you cannot separate the theory from the response. It demands a sustained quotidian commitment to the struggle for national liberation, a new humanism, a man in whole based on inclusivity and not exclusivity. One does not liberate people by alienating people. And liberation movements demand that oppressed people be given human rights, self-determination, freedom from hunger, and one man, one vote. And it is an attitude. It demands responsibility and the willingness to take many perspectives, particularly those who have been harmed or their very existence questioned. It is what decolonial feminist thinkers have referred to as relational ways of seeing the world, including the relation between privilege and oppression. Indeed, feminist theory demands the removal of these very hierarchical structures that allow the harm to exist. Decolonialism is confronting the biopolitic that controls, dominates, and commodifies subjects in nature, and it requires intentional action in our anti-colonialism. It requires a committed involvement. The principle of Ubuntu, solidarity, the methodology of rooted cosmopolitanism can also provide us some guidance on a way forward. Ubuntu is an ethical and legal principle from Southern Africa that roughly translates to I am because we are. It is fundamentally a principle of solidarity and togetherness that understands our existence is tangled up with others. And Ubuntu can be expanded into our relationships between humans and nature. We are because nature is. Our identity is deeply entwined with nature's identity. It can also be extended to the nation state. A state is a state because of other states. This relational sovereignty with intentional decoloniality can confront historical injustices and methodologies and better guide national and global governance and decision-making. After all, just as with individuals in a community, a state's identity and well-being is deeply intertwined within the community of states, and its decisions and the rule of law should reflect that. Ubuntu goes hand in hand with rooted cosmopolitanism, a methodology that values the particular multidimensional place and value of each person and how that place informs the wider community. These concepts, life, care, empathy, understand that our value is our diversity and that we should not reach for some amorphous, anonymous universality, but rather see that through our differences, can we not only sustain, but flourish. An ethical engagement can provide the space for these serious inquiries on individual and communal relations, right and wrong behavior towards one another and towards the community, and when responsibility attaches. And to end, there are several efforts in law and governance that are doing this, and I'm happy to be a part of many of them. Efforts that recognize the rights of nature and indigenous law, or the particular power of humans to harm and the attached responsibilities, such as earth trusteeship. Efforts that emphasize the basis of ecological systems to all governance systems and decentralize the role of humans, such as with the Ecological Law and Governance Association, Earth Jurisprudence, Earth Law, and efforts that realize our relations and our limits in relation to one another are necessary for our common future. And that would be the planetary boundaries work, also the relatos, meaning to relate, of the Biosphere Ethics Initiative. So I will conclude by saying, as Ron Engel says, our final speaker today, the covenants that constrain us, sustain us. Thank you very much. And I apologize if I went a little bit over. So let me stop share and then I will turn it over to Bruce. Let me just give a quick introduction to our next speaker. So please continue to write in chat if you have any questions at all, and we'll save those for at the end of the time. Okay, so to quickly introduce Bruce, Bruce Jennings will be speaking on refounding democratic covenants, the ethics and politics of solidarity and care. He is a political theorist by training, and he is associate professor in the Department of Health Policy and Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University. He's written widely on democratic theory and participation, ecological governance, and climate justice and ethics. He also serves as senior advisor and fellow at the Hastings Center in New York, senior fellow at the Center for Humans and Nature in Chicago, and is co-editor of a great book, Liberty and the Ecological Crisis, Freedom on a Finite Planet. He's also author of Ecological Governance, Toward a New Social Contract with the Earth, and co-editor for the ethics section of the Encyclopedia of the Anthropocene. Bruce, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. Hello, and thank you for being with us, everyone. In my initial presentation, I am going to define and discuss the idea of what I call a generational covenant. Our historical moment is a trinity of global failures. We are failing to preserve and foster ecological diversity. We are failing to promote economic equality. We are failing to sustain and extend democratic empowerment. The degree and causes of these three failures and crises are not self-evident, but their reality is. It is my starting point. All societies and political cultures, especially democratic and pluralistic ones, require a glue of common or shared meaning, purpose, and value. Historically, two metaphors have reinforced and sustained such underlying cohesion by making it cognitively compelling. One is the notion of contract, and the other is the notion of covenant. Many use these terms as synonyms. I suggest that one useful way to discuss them is with the distinction between transactional agreement and transformational agreement. On the whole, the discourse of contract, drawn from law, and the social contract, drawn from political theory, tends to emphasize transactional relationship among the contracting parties based on individualistic or group interest calculations of advantage through the terms of the agreement. Contract fits best with self-interested sociality and self-identity, let alone partisan politics. Contract does create the space and trust for mutual cooperation, but the arc of such transaction bends toward competition. The idea of contract reinforces individuation, deracination, and autonomy. By contrast, a less atomistic participant figures into a covenant, one whose ongoing social interdependence is embraced through the assumption and avowal of an enduring commitment. In short, a contract is a tool for successful dealing. A covenant is a way of enhanced being. My central proposition is that these three crises of ecology, equality, and democracy can only be engaged profoundly or successfully deflected through something I propose to call a generational covenant. As I see it, the terms of a generational covenant reject human sovereignty over planetary life and affirm human symbiosis with and within planetary life. If we could get our minds right about the interdependent nature of our human being, we could embrace a generational covenant as the guiding embodiment of that condition. Conversely, if we could embrace a generational covenant and begin to pursue the commitments that accompany it in our ecological and democratic governance, then we would begin to practice interdependent symbiotic living and gradually come to mind nature and comprehend the reality of our own existence. Which comes first, agreeing to a covenant or realizing its promise in our lives? Neither one comes first. We do them at the same time and a little at a time. How can a concept called covenant aid us in replacing human sovereignty with human symbiosis? Symbiosis literally means living together. And in using it here, I simply mean interdependence, which is the foundation of metabolic, social, and political life. A symbiose is a companion. Such companionship can take many forms. I believe that in social and political living together today, humankind's best aspiration remains a democratic form of equal moral standing and justice for all. Covenants are thought and imagined, but like the dead and the not yet living, covenants are not dreams, and they are not merely written words. They are real and efficacious because they are symbolic meanings embedded in human language and cognition. As such, they influence our thoughts and feelings, our convictions and contentments, our deliberate acts, and our unreflective habits. Covenants impel human beings to mind nature, to pay attention to its needs, to respect its limits, and to attend to its flourishing, because symbiotic life is at their root. A covenant is an ongoing form of life or way of living, not simply a transitory agreement. Covenantal thinking can be as enduring and as deeply rooted in our minds and our bodies' politic as symbiosis itself is in the systems and phenomenon of being alive. In order for a covenantal imagination to develop and mature, we have to somehow turn down monetized and ideological noise and tune up democratic voice. That can be furthered through critical dialogues in many venues and on many fronts. Dialogues in which the presuppositions of our present questions, practices, and institutions are scrutinized. Deliberations in which pathways toward reimagined future possibilities are charted. Conversations nurturing, at long last, authentic civic learning and participatory citizenship. The ideas most closely associated semantically with covenant is binding. Binding has a moral meaning as obliged, duty-bound, committed. It also has a social meaning as membership, affiliation, being held together, being interdependent. Contract binds also, but it does so for mutual advantage, not for mutual transformation. Covenant redirects us to the concrete limits of the planet and the terms of our welcome on it. I turn now to the rationale for forging a generational covenant. I perceive that we lack in our politics and in our everyday lives adequate conceptual vocabularies of ethics and political theory with which to address the morality of present actions in light of their effects on future generations. At the end of April, we might note, of 2021, the German Federal Constitutional Court recognized this as a legal requirement incumbent on government policymaking as a matter of Germany's basic law. If contemporaneous non-human forms of life should have legal recognition and standing, and I think they should, then why not also non-human species in the future and humans yet to be born? With this in mind, I suggest we speak of the generational covenant of an ecological democracy. Some of the parties to this covenant, the dead, are no longer biologically embodied as organisms, but they are present and active in other ways. Parties to the covenant yet to be born have their lives and flourishing entrusted to the ongoing political community of the living who strive toward the common good. In binding the generations across time, covenant encompasses growth in moral awareness, greater realization of the inherent value and worth of all species, and fuller human self-realization of each and all through life in a democratic culture and participation in common deliberation across time. If our generation and the next fails to recover and carry forward the covenant between the living and the dead and the not yet alive, we may risk undermining political systems that aspire to some measure of popular consent, relational solidarity, and mutual care and concern as aspirational facets of political life. That would be a profound civilizational and human loss. It would undermine our sense of rootedness and continuity. It would hobble our capacity to interpret and reinterpret authority, freedom, and duty. I say both interpret and reinterpret deliberately here, because a generational covenant does not require a dogmatic, uncritical traditionalism. Far from it. The twin tasks of sustaining relational being among humans and fulfilling intergenerational moral responsibility require us as democratic citizens to acknowledge what the dead have done to make us possible, to learn from it, to draw strength from it, and to atone for it, especially in the fossil carbon era. Acknowledge the generational covenant with gratitude if the work of the past has been constructive, or with humility and correction if that work has been unjust and destructive. In the global capitalist world of commodification and monetization, the transactional individualism of contractual agreements is ascendant. How might the generational covenant counteract that? By fostering a persistent yearning by the living to honor the dead and to keep faith with the future. From the study of early childhood cognitive development and evidence of burial practices in the early sites of the genus Homo, there is reason to think that a sensibility and imagination named by this covenant are etched in the human biology of continuing gestation after birth in a social world and the deep time of human relationality. The strengths of modern democracy bear this imprint. The shortcomings of modern democracy bear its effacement. I hope that these remarks about the notion of generational covenant will facilitate further discussion today and in the days ahead. I hope in turn that this discussion can assist the about face that our democracy and our civilization so sorely needs. I conclude with a word about the link between covenant and solidarity. Not only do we suffer from a lack of symbiotic and intergenerational thinking, we also face a solidarity deficit and with it, a crisis of legitimacy and trust. This notion of regrounding democracy is an important point of contact between the metaphoric affirmation of the symbiotic human condition offered by generational covenant and the discourse of democratic citizenship and political morality. Just as symbiotic interdependence is at the heart of a socially embedded and organically embodied human life, so at the heart of a just democratic way of life are practices of moral recognition. One such practice of recognition is solidarity. The practice of solidarity involves a recognition of one's own membership and the membership of others in a web of obligations to affirm, attend to, and deal fairly with others, buttressed by the expectation that they will fulfill their obligations of membership toward you in the same way. Extending such expectations across generations, both backward and forward, helps to strengthen and reassure contemporaneous expectations among members of the current generation. The end of solidarity is to displace exploitative relationships and unjust exclusion by just relationality, recognition, and equal standing. Solidarity contains a recognition that individual well-being and rights do not exist in a state of isolation, but rather inhabit an ecology of common flourishing that can neither be achieved nor fully enjoyed by individuals acting on their own. Solidarity feeds on the gratitude we feel when we remember the services and contributions by those who have lived before us, those still living who reared and built us, and the responsibility we should feel as our actions pave the way for future contributions that subsequent generations will make, and for the necessary changes that future generations will require and demand. Solidarity affirms the moral standing of others by our standing up, beside, for, and with them. Solidarity inherently leads us to view our own lives and actions as bound together with the rights, well-being, health, and dignity of others, here and there, now and then, already, but not yet. This is precisely the outlook needed in this, our vulnerable, precarious time of 3 crises and 4 horsemen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that incredibly thought-provoking talk. I particularly appreciated this unpacking of the promise of symbiosis, and also just the idea of a generational covenant and thinking about the role of the dead, you know, and honoring them and recognizing and respecting and the place that they play in this long continuum or relationship or covenant. And then this, and also discussing the solidarity deficit. So thank you so much for that very important talk. Thank you. And I hope that we unpack it further. So, okay, I'll now be moving on to Professor Dr. J. Ronald Engel. Over the course of his lifetime, Ron has been a high school biology teacher, park ranger, Chicago community organizer, Unitarian Universalist minister, university professor, author, and leader in local, national, and international conservation and religious movements, and friend and family. The most important titles. Through his professional appointments at Meadville Lombard Theological School and University of Chicago Divinity School and College, he helped to pioneer the academic fields of environmental ethics and theology. Through his work with the National Council of Churches and as co-director of the program on ecology, justice, and faith, he contributed to the emergence of the movement of eco-justice within the ecumenical religious community. In 1984, he founded the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law Ethics Specialist Group, which was then known as the Ethics Working Group. So our founder. In the 1990s, Ron served as a core member of the International Drafting Committee of the Earth Charter, launched in 2000 as widely endorsed civil society proposal for a comprehensive global ethic for the 21st century. In 2001, he participated in the founding of the Center for Humans and Nature and led its Global Responsibilities program for a following decade. His work in global ethics and covenant theology is the subject of critical appreciation and response. Ron and his life partner, Joan, also friend, family to me, make their home in Tucson, Arizona. And today, Ron will be speaking about making the Earth Covenant. Thank you, Ron. And I'll pull up your image as well.
Thank you, Katie. And again, thank everyone for joining us. It's going to be clear from my comments that the two of us are preaching very much the same gospel. Katie, your passionate prophetic critique of our contemporary situation, and Bruce, your eloquent summary of the character of covenantal relationships are part and parcel of what I would like to also bring home. And I think since you've done so much of the groundwork, I will try to skip some of the parts of my own presentation so that we have more time to discuss with the rest of the group. Let me just say that I found myself in thinking about today, going back and renewing conversation with a long list of authors and figures who have provided touchstones for me over the years in thinking about these matters, and also acknowledge what it has been acknowledged by Bruce and Katie, which is very true, that we've been in conversation on these matters for many, many years, and they have been a precious conversation that we have shared. So let's, for the sake of structure and simplicity, look at the 4 primary proposals, postulates, theses that I want to advance this morning as briefly as I can. The first is that democracy is driven by faith in our capacity to govern ourselves in freedom, equality, and community. So this element, if you take nothing else away from my discussions, that ultimately democracy as we think about it is a faith before it is a political and social system. The crisis in democracy we're experiencing is due to a false appraisal of the legitimacy and presuppositions of the democratic faith. 3, the authentic democratic faith is founded in covenantal commitments and relations. And finally, the covenantal promise of the democratic faith was broken by the Faustian bargain of modernity, but it can be renewed by making an earth covenant founded on our love for the world. So these are the basic elements, outline of the structure of what I want to say. And again, I'll try to compress this as much as possible. And I've been helped immensely by the comments made by both Katie and Bruce as we've gone along. One of the persons that I began to re-engage after some years' absence is a man by the name of Patrick Deneen, who is currently a political philosopher at Notre Dame University. And he wrote a book in 2006 entitled Democratic Faith. And he points in that book to what he considers the near universal embrace of democracy as the sole legitimate form of government. Quote, the only regime most living humans now deem worthy of serious consideration, exploration, clarification, articulation, exportation, importation, and finally, faith. And then he goes on to largely address this element of faith. In the sense, I take it from what he said, although he doesn't explicitly define it this way, of William James, that faith is a cause that we believe ultimately worthy and true, but the outcome of which is not yet certain. Yet we are willing to risk our lives to achieve it. And that is I think an accurate representation of the faith in democracy that in 2006, with some degree of credibility, Patrick Deneen could argue is widely embraced. We've said that other definitions of the faith of democracy, government of and for and by the people, as Lincoln said, but it is much more substantive than this. And I was delighted to hear Katie's introduction of freedom, equality, and community, or fraternity, or sorority, or solidarity in Bruce's language, the red, white, and blue of historical movements, revolutionary movements often, that in fact exercised and demonstrated the democratic faith. So the democratic faith is a moral faith in the capacity of humans to rule themselves in keeping with principles and virtues of freedom, equality, and community. And as the philosopher Carol Gould argues, this is the prism of the democratic faith. Each of these is independent in itself, but also related to each of the others. I would argue further that the faith is not only a moral faith, it is a spiritual faith. It is our capacity as humans for spiritual self-government, as well as political and moral self-government. We are able to make decisions about our ultimate place and meaning in the cosmos. Thomas Masaryk, the founder of the modern state of Czechoslovakia, said democracy is humanity subspecies aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. Now that ultimate meaning and ground for democracy has very largely been associated over its history with this worldly, naturalistic, often even materialistic understandings of human existence. And certainly, as Katie indicated, the category of life as, in some sense, a life-centered spirituality. Walt Whitman, it's no accident, was the first, as we understand it, to use the term democratic faith. So the earth and its history is the theater in which humanity's ultimate meaning and purpose is to be found. And our faith in the moral and spiritual capacity of human beings for free, equal, and communal self-government within the conditions of life as they're given in the natural world. Now, it's also a tradition, and that is something that Jeffrey Stout has written extensively about. McIntyre defines a tradition, a living tradition, as one in which there is an historically extended, socially embodied argument precisely about the goods which constitute the tradition. So when we think and back off for a minute and look at the democratic faith, it is one in which there has been over many centuries, all over several thousand years, that I would hold, an extended argument about the priority, the character, the interrelationships between freedom, equality, and community, and about the terms on which we are to live with nature on this earth, in this world. I think that Bruce's excellent distinction and introduction with regard to the contrast between contract and covenant has been an essential part of that argument and has defined in many ways the democratic tradition since its beginning. Now, the second posture that I want to advance is that the crisis in democracy we are experiencing is due to a false appraisal of the legitimacy and presuppositions of the grounds of the democratic faith. When Deneen wrote what he did in 2006, only 10 years later, there was a very revealing article in the Journal of Democracy by Roberto Foa and Yashka Munk called The Democratic Disconnect, in which they had surveyed and were drawing upon numerous surveys around the world regarding the lack of legitimacy and faith in our political institutions, our parliaments, our courts, that this had all perilously fallen. And yet, their major point was that this was being denied by political commentators at the time, that there was evidence that across the world, a growing lack of confidence that we are able to govern ourselves morally and spiritually in the fashion that the democratic revolutionary faiths have affirmed. And as Katie so well reviewed in her rundown of where we are today, this has been certainly the questionable character of the capacity of human beings to govern themselves well is certainly evident. And of course, at the same time, we've been introduced, particularly in the last decade, to the dark sides of our own democratic histories. And we don't have to go through all that revelation in order to understand the challenges to the democratic faith today. Yet, I would also say that much of liberal political and even philosophical thought is still devoted to, in a way, shoring up the signs, the institutions, the procedures of established democratic regimes, and in the hopes that somehow this will meet the crisis in our faith. Whereas, as Katie said so well, the very pretense of democratic self-government and the failure to believe in it has certainly been a driver for the appearance of authoritarianism in so many of our societies, including, of course, the United States. I would hold, however, with Patrick Deneen that we have failed the disciplines of philosophy, theology, which almost entirely neglects a phenomenon called democratic faith as anything distinctive, worthy of attention, comparable to the religious traditions with which most theologians work, to actually see and make a thoroughgoing critique of the presuppositions of the democratic faith. And that is something that Deneen set himself about, and he finally argued that this faith lies largely, the grounds for it, on our faith or confidence that humans can make it happen, that the capacity for making, for building, for construction, homo faber, which was also the critique of Hannah Arendt, as you know, was the undergirding evident a basis for our confidence. And I think that is well attested to by the, again, the strong continuing belief in development as the way in which we will achieve freedom, equality, and community. The living in Arizona, as my wife and I now do, in the mega drought, the mega heat wave, one would think that our alleged democratic societies would be taking a new approach to human settlement, and yet, in fact, it seems to be the opposite, that the society at large is ever more committed to growth and development and denying the finitude and constraints of our living on this planet. And in a way, although I agree with much that Mr. Biden is doing, I am also impressed by the degree to which a large infrastructure development is again considered to be a means for realizing the democratic promise. Now let's very quickly go on to the point about covenant and my own coming to the conviction and the insight, I suppose, which we three share, that authentic democratic faith in our capacity to govern ourselves in freedom, equality, and community is ultimately founded in the quality of our covenantal commitments and relations. And I must say that I began that theme in my own work very early under the mentorship of a professor of theology at Harvard, James Luther Adams, who directed me to a marvelous essay by H. Richard Niebuhr published in 1954, The Idea of Covenant in American Democracy, and I recommend it to you highly. I don't think I have time to quote from it here, but his assertion was that, here, let me just read this very briefly, but one may raise the question whether our common life could have been established, could have been maintained, and whether it can endure without the presence of the conviction that we live in a world that has the moral structure of a covenant, and without the presence in it of persons who have achieved responsible citizenship by exercising the kind of freedom that appears in their taking upon themselves the obligations of unlimited loyalty under God to principles of truth-telling, of justice, of loyalty to one another, of indissoluble union. That was in 1954. And looking at the history of theology and philosophical thought over the following years, one must say that one is impressed by the lack of attention that acknowledgement or that thesis achieved. I have a long list of those persons that I have turned to over the years who have in fact tried to lift up the covenantal foundations of democratic society, beginning with J.C. Taylor, The Mask of Society in 1966, Robert Bellah, of course, with his Broken Covenant in 1972, Philip Selznick in his work, The Moral Commonwealth, on his discussion of Covenant of Reason, on down through to a figure that Nigel Dowler, who is here with us today, recommended to me, a remarkable leader in the Reformed Jewish community in England, Jonathan Sacks, and his book, The Dignity of Difference, proposing, again, the fundamental importance of covenant for international understanding. And most recently, I'll skip a number of these, a marvelous book that has just been published called The American Covenant, written by two authors in the National Park Service of the United States, in which they argue that national parks are covenants between the different elements of American society, all without regard to religion or lack thereof, have ownership, right to access, and responsibilities under covenants that established our national parks. And I had a chance to talk to them a few weeks ago, and they said there simply was no other concept other than covenant that was able to capture the intergenerational relationships that they wanted to propose as lying at the very heart of covenant. One of the things that I mentioned in my preparation for this was a book by Pete Davis called Dedication. And if any of you may have had a chance, if you haven't, you ought to at least hear his 8-minute speech that he gave upon graduation at Harvard Law School a couple years ago, in which he indicates has had millions of downloads. And in it, he contrasts what he calls the dominant culture of infinite browsing, keeping our options open, and he's speaking to his generation, of course, versus the counterculture of dedication. And metaphorically, he sums that up at the end of his book by calling that the reforestation of the planet. So I don't have time to go into the details of that book. It's a marvelous tour de force of the meaning of dedication today in many different walks of life. And he argues at one point that a culture of commitment is a prerequisite to democracy, but he does not use, own, or advance the word covenant, or does he indicate in his acknowledgments any acquaintance with the covenantal traditions of thought, either theologically or more broadly philosophically developed. So we have someone who has his finger on the pulse of a society that is thoroughly imbued with keeping one's options open for oneself and not dedicating oneself to what he calls the long haul of a commitment to a particular cause or purpose that serves the common weal, but nonetheless has not yet become acquainted with the covenantal discourse that those of us here today are affirming and struggling with. Now, the one thing that is clear, though, from his book, just in the contrast between the culture of infinite browsing, he sees a profound rupture in our contemporary world. And this, according to a number of the theological figures, is a fundamental way betrayed the covenants that upon which the good of our lives has depended. The gifts, as Bruce says, of the past, the very gifts of the natural world that sustains us.
You're hitting something because your voice disappears.
Okay. Joan says my voice disappears.
It went away for about 10 seconds ago,
Okay.
and then it caught up. But I think now it seems to be working well. So
Great. Okay. So let me conclude with what I think really is a way of making our statement of the faith of democratic practice a matter of profound theological and religious moment by at least advancing the thesis that our alienation goes not only to the most outwardly outward manifestations of that, our alienation from one another, of countries from one another, our alienation from the natural world, it seems to me, all of which is very abundant in the list of that Katie gave us at the beginning. But it's an alienation that is profoundly rooted in the human transcendence spiritually to choose our ultimate commitment. A unique aspect of the species that is called upon to own its ultimate vocation. And that has largely, because of the split in sacred secular facets of our civilizations and the association or limitation of the spiritual dimension to discrete religious communities very largely, we have been blocked, robbed, as it were, from facing that question of where, in fact, our ultimate covenantal loyalties ought to lie. And one, I think, sees that very evident in this incredible drive for escaping the Earth. Billionaires going up in space rockets and offering such rides to similar billionaires who might wish to have that thrill. But all the talk of Mars, settling Mars, the sense that the Earth, in fact, is a kind of prison, and that to realize this is embraced by Democrats as well as all others, it seems, in the popular culture at least, that our destiny lies beyond this earth itself. And this, of course, is the famous opening to Hannah Arendt's Human Condition, where she speaks about the species for the first time having, it would seem, perhaps the physical ability to do that. So when I went back and looked at the beginning of the Faustian legend, which in so many ways is one of the most prominent legends in almost all cultures today across the world, and found the original statement that Faust is imagined to have made to Mephistopheles in the Faust book of 1585. He says that he will take this contract of 20 years to the utmost. I will have full power to do with me at my pleasure, be it body, soul, flesh, blood, or goods, and therefore I defy God and his Christ, all the host of heaven, and all living creatures that bear the shape of God, yea, all that lives. And I had a colleague here at the University of Arizona in the German department go back and recheck that original German. And he said, yes, that's what it is. That is not a mistranslation. It was all that lives, and all that lives is more than all human beings who had, of course, the image of God within them, according to the theology of the time. But all that lives. It was a decisive break at the very beginning of the modern age with a covenant to the order of being, as Václav Havel calls it, the order of nature, the order of this planet. And that is what I believe is finally at stake in all of our hopes for covenant, because once that is made, then many of the virtues and the characteristics of covenant that Bruce so beautifully laid before us, the gratitude for the past, the responsibility for the future, begins to fall into place. And I think this is the reason why we have heard in recent decades a number of calls for a covenant with the earth. It's the obligation now for those of us who have heard that call for ourselves to find ways through law, through theology, through ethics, through work of various kinds, through all the dedicational activities that Pete Davis describes, to answer that. I've always been struck, and this will be my final statement, with Hannah Arendt's position at the end of her life when she said, what is most difficult is to love the world as it is, with all the evil and suffering in it. And yet she did not make, although she may have personally made the next step, she did not make it in her philosophy, as I understand it, which is to make a covenant based on that love. And that is the way to, in fact, hopefully begin to pull this world together and heal the profoundly broken relationships under which we labor. So thank you. That is my effort to cover some, this is no small subject we're involved in.
In 90 minutes, 90 minutes. So thank you so much for that profound, again, incredibly thought-provoking talk. I just, and when you turned on Faust's words, on that Faustian pact, and against all life, and it immediately took me to the parallels of the necrophilic behavior of colonialism, and even, of course, neoliberalism and hyper-capitalism. So we see these connections. I think, for my own story to begin with, our broken covenants, and Bruce to take us through these transformative covenants, and Ron to then provide us with this democratic faith as a covenant and based on love, because philia is love. It's just what you love. It's presented, I think, a nice picture for the group. Now, for the next few minutes, I would just like to ask Ron or Bruce if you have any comments that you'd like to add, just as a response to what the panelists as a whole have put down, or we can go ahead and open it up to the floor as well. So, Bruce?
I'd like to say one quick word
Ron.
in response to Bruce, because here in Tucson, one of the most powerful civic rituals, if it is the most powerful civic ritual of this city, is the procession through the city by literally thousands upon thousands of people on the All Souls Memorial Day. The All Souls procession, in which people just pour out of their neighborhoods this is, of course, an extremely diverse ethnic community, and celebrate their gratitude and share their gratitude to
Oh no, did it cut away again?
Seems like he's being paused. Maybe the computer is trying to buffer or something.
Yeah.
To the dead.
Oh, there.
It a hunger for what Bruce, I think, one of the things Bruce was trying to say.
Bruce, were you able to catch
Katie,
that?
I do have something I'd like to add also before we
Please,
throw it
please
open.
do.
One thing that I wonder about myself in terms of what I'm doing and what we're all doing today here is the how does one best understand the relationship between theory and practice, you might say. And what I'm trying to do is based on a kind of desperate gamble. The gamble is that before we do something and make change and move in a different direction and electrify, our power needs and so forth and so on, which we desperately need to do. And you can watch the amazing struggle of paralysis, mistrust, and now I've got a new word to add to my quiver, necrophilia, going on in Washington, D.C. right now about something as simple as, transitioning the power grid. Simple, simple. But so my thought, though, nevertheless, is that if we just start out in undertake practice, let's do something, without attending to the concepts and theories and ideas that guide or should guide what we're doing. It's not at all clear to me that we'll get to where we want to go or need to go or have to go. And therefore I defend the notion of conceptual analysis and the sort of convergence that I think we're seeing in the presentations today between the disciplines of theology, law, jurisprudence, and political theory. I think theorizing is a very important thing to do precisely because it is the basis of our practice. And that's sort of intellectually, but it's also deeply embedded in our culture. And that's where rituals, processions, things like that come into play, Ron. There's a lot of unstated theorizing at work in our everyday lives. I think we just happen to be at a trying historical moment, a moment of consequences, as Winston Churchill put it, when we have to be more explicit and more self-reflective about the theoretical commitments that we're making or assumptions than we usually have to be, because we are really looking at a reset of our technology and our ways of life in relationship to planetary systems and their safe operating margins and so on. So I'm reminded of a French colleague who said, that may work in practice, but it's no good in theory. That's why I want to devote whatever time I can to figuring out what is correct in theory.
And
somebody has to do that.
I completely agree. And I think that so much of that speaks to this democratic deficit of dialogue and spaces for this type of engagement to occur. And, in some communities, it's much easier to have a meeting or a space in a library where you can talk about, civic engagement and organization. And other communities have health issues, have food issues, have work issues, have incarceration issues. So there is no space to be created, So I think that's where it comes on. Gosh, I don't even know whose shoulders it falls upon. Maybe the ones who took those spaces away and created those hardships for those spaces to not be able to even occur. But it'll take what was intentional efforts on others' parts to go into those worlds to see how they already engage and to honor that instead of creating some, space for democratic dialogue. Like go to the churches or the restaurants or the grocery store, and find the ways that, because it's happening, it's just not highlighted by those in power. And so then they see as themselves as separate from those in power, and they are. Yeah. So, Ron, any final comments? And we'll open up the floor.
Well, no, just that, yes. One is hard put to find figures like Jonathan Sachs within the theological community. Cornell West certainly one, or within the legal philosophical community, like Richard Falk or Patrick Deneen, or, who have in fact taken the democratic faith as their focus, their community of faith.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about how, but of course,
Oh no, it's breaking up again.
all those great traditions have fed our subject of serious critical theoretical reflection. Is, I honestly believe, the biggest step we have not yet embraced.
Okay. All right. I think what we'll go ahead and do now is open it up to questions from our participants. And I see that, Jeff, did you have a question that you'd like to ask?
Thanks to all of you for this, really, bringing this to such a deep, fundamental spiritual level. It's so important. So thank you very much. I had this question where be just welcome hearing from any of you more about how we can bring indigenous worldviews into the new kind of covenants we need to embrace and nurture, because doing so seems to me a kind of decolonization project in part that addresses, for example, the enormous harm of the doctrine of discovery and a lot of the things that were brought out in your presentations. And we see things like the Whanganui River settlement, which is sort of throwing things up into a different, it's a different way of moving forward, where those worldviews have to be front and center when the future of the river is considered. So just if you have any thoughts about that.
Bruce?
Yeah, well, I've got one thought, Jeff, which might start us off anyhow. I've been interested in, even working on myself lately, the distinction between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And I think that in the domain of climate mitigation, the technological transformation from a fossil carbon energy system to an electrified, sustainable basis, solar, wind, et cetera, energy system is the main aspect to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and it is within our grasp. I think perhaps even in a feasible time frame, and it will help a lot. And there, I think there's been already a tremendous cooperation between government, science, and private industry. So this is not out of the goodness of its heart. It's just happens to coincide with good, business investment, future-oriented, and responsibly to create a new technology. So there isn't really anything strikingly new there. It's just that the technology being switched to can be incredibly helpful and beneficial, but it won't solve all of our issues with climate. And so this is an example of, in one way to put it, is this is where a covenant and a contract kind of overlap. They kind of work in the same direction. But with adaptation, it's going to be much broader, and it's going to affect many, many more things in terms of the way human beings engage in agricultural and economic activity. And I think it will be necessary for there to be a much more decentralized and participatory governance approach here then. Small business may be a good partner. I don't know if corporate business will get on board. I don't know what their calculus would be in terms of the advantages to their future as a financial entity. I hope that they will see many positives in the adaptation process, but I suspect they will also oppose many other aspects of land use planning and other changes, water and so on.
Yeah.
So I think that's the exciting future, and where we really need to stress not the, I think Biden is politically smart in saying this is not an ecological issue, this is a sort of a technological advancing issue. Fine, so be it. But I think we're not going to be able to put that mask on it with a lot of the adaptation measures that will be needed. So we really have to kind of gird our loins with conceptual commitments and arguments and reasons why certain kinds of sacrifices will have to be made.
And Jeff, I would, oh, sorry, go ahead, Bruce. Okay. And Jeff, I would only add, how do we reconcile, with any harmed peoples? Of course, we increase their worldview and the visibility of the worldview, and that responsibility is on those who have benefited from the harms. But I think there's also a recognition of indigenous law as a standalone law, not as just something we're just going to take and incorporate principles, which is something else we should do. But we should also respect that they have bodies and rule of law of their own, and it's legitimate. And it's not legitimate because we say it's legitimate on its own accord. And also noting the diversity of indigenous laws. They're not just some big homogeneous indigenous peoples. They have tribes and cultures and histories, just as the diversity of any group of people. And I think that we need to respect and honor that diversity as well. Lastly, I would only say that the most important thing we can do is to prevent future harm, because then we don't have to hit that reconciliation stage. It's in some of this international criminal law work that I do with these really heavy crimes against humanity, genocide. Once you get to that stage, you've lost. Once those harms have happened, you've lost. What we need to do is focus on prevention of continuous harm and disrespect to indigenous peoples. And I think that would be a major thing for jurisprudence moving forward. But we are at 2 minutes past. I will allow it to go 5, just so that we keep to a tight recording. Ron, did you have any? There was a question from the chat room too, but if you'd like to add a few more.
I will say one. I'll say one word. So,
okay.
And I want to use the word, Jeff, revelation. We are passing through a revelation today, profound revelation of both the evil that we have done and the good that still lies potentially in the cultures and history of our world. And I think the indigenous people's experience displays both of those, and it provides a profound pivot on which we could begin to think about what a covenant with Earth would mean.
Excellent. Okay, I'm just going through any last questions or comments. And if we miss you, please email me. I'm on the website. My email's on the website, and I'll make sure that it gets to Bruce and Ron. So don't see this as the end all be all. And we are planning a bigger symposium on this topic. So if you're interested in joining us for that as well. Okay, so we will end with a question from Nigel to the group. Please, Nigel.
All right. So thank you. Very interesting discussion from all of you. I've learned quite a bit about the idea of covenant from both Ron and Bruce's presentations, because as Ron knows, I promote a global ethic which doesn't actually explicitly use the idea of covenant, but it fits in very well with a lot of what you're saying. But the real question I wanted to ask was to Katie, because you obviously have a very strong down on the whole idea of development. Now, as you may know, I've been very active for over 20 years in the International Development Ethics Association.
Yes, of course. That's how we met.
And we are not for the kind of model of development you're attacking.
Okay.
Far from it. We're precisely
Good. I know that.
argue for models of development which precisely incorporate the values we're talking about today.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should throw the whole idea of development out with all the terrible things that are often associated with it. I think we have to do battle with the concept of development, as you are doing battle with the concept of democracy. I mean, providing a persuasive account of a good way of thinking of development, as with a good way of thinking about democracy and so on. So I wouldn't want us to go away thinking that somehow, oh, we've got to just ditch the whole concept of development. I think we have to do battle for its soul.
I agree, Nigel. And I think we just need to tell the evolution of the word as well. You know, that there is this darkness and it's done a lot of damage, and it's a powerful word. But if we just go to development as solution, we skip that history, that crucial history that skips over people, loss, harm. So, and I know we find common cause because we're colleagues. So. All right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Like I said, this is just a step in the longer path that we're taking together on discussing our crises of democracy and how to move forward. So I will be posting the recording of this to share. And thank you so much again for joining us. And next month, just so I don't forget, next month's webinar will be from the River Ethiop Trust Foundation on spirituality and the rights of nature in Africa on Tuesday, August 17th. So mark your calendars, please. All right. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, all of you. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.